Sometimes the truth we speak in our most vulnerable moments becomes the foundation someone else has been searching for. A man who had already lost everything found himself holding the hand of a stranger who had everything except a reason to wake up. What he whispered in that hospital room wasn't meant to be heard, but it was. And some confessions, once spoken into the right silence, changed two lives forever. Stay with this. Some stories don't rush, they root. The hospital hallway smelled like disinfectant and old coffee, a combination Marcus Chen had long stopped noticing. He pushed his cleaning cart past the nurse's station on the 4th floor, nodding to the night staff who barely looked up from their charts. It was nearly midnight. His shift had started at 6 that evening and wouldn't end until 2 in the morning. After that, he'd go home, sleep for 4 hours, wake Zoe for school, and report to his day job at the warehouse by 9. This was the rhythm. It had been for 3 years now, since Sarah died and the medical bills became a second mortgage on a life already stretched thin. He was wiping down the railings near the ICU when the chaos arrived. Paramedics shouting, nurses rushing, the sharp electronic wail of monitors being prepped. A gurney swept past him, and Marcus stepped back against the wall, making himself invisible the way custodial staff learned to do. He caught fragments: car accident, head trauma, stable vitals, someone important. "That's Julian Ashford," one of the nurses said, her voice pitched with recognition. "The Julian Ashford, tech billionaire, CEO of Ashford Dynamics." "Figures," another nurse muttered. "Even unconscious, these guys get the VIP suite." Marcus kept cleaning. Wealth was a foreign language to him, one he'd never had reason to learn. He'd heard the name before everyone had, but it meant nothing in the context of his own life. Billionaires existed in a different atmosphere, breathing different air. By 2 a.m., the ICU had quieted. The man Ashford was stable, they said. Unconscious but expected to recover, Marcus finished his rounds on the lower floors and returned to the 4th for a final pass before clocking out. He moved through the dim hallways with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times, his thoughts already drifting toward home. Zoe would be asleep in her bed, her small body curled around the stuffed rabbit Sarah had given her. He'd check on her, maybe sit in the doorway for a minute, just to hear her breathe. He paused outside the ICU room where they'd taken Ashford. The door was partially open. Inside, machines beeped in steady rhythm. Marcus didn't know why he stopped. Maybe it was the silence, so complete it felt like held breath. Maybe it was exhaustion, making him careless. He glanced down the hall. No one in stepped just inside the doorway. The man in the bed looked younger than Marcus expected. Mid-30s, maybe. Dark hair, pale skin, an expensive watch still on his wrist. His face was unmarked, peaceful in a way that seemed unearned. Marcus had seen plenty of unconscious patients. Most looked vulnerable. This man just looked alone. Marcus leaned against the doorframe, suddenly too tired to move. He shouldn't be here. He had no reason to be here. But something about the stillness pulled words out of him, the kind of words that only came in the deep hours when exhaustion stripped away every defense. "You know what's strange?" Marcus said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "People think money fixes things, that if you have enough of it, you're protected, safe." He exhaled, shaking his head. "But it doesn't work that way. My wife Sarah, she got sick, and we had insurance, savings, everything we were supposed to have, and it still wasn't enough. She still died. And I still wake up every day trying to figure out how to be enough for our daughter." He didn't know why he was talking to an unconscious stranger. Maybe because the man couldn't respond, couldn't judge, couldn't offer the empty platitudes Marcus had heard 1,000 times. "She's in a better place. You're so strong. Time heals." "Zoe asked me last week if I was lonely," Marcus continued, his voice rough. "She's 7. 7 years old, and she's worrying about me. I told her no, because what else do you say? But the truth is, yeah, I'm lonely. I'm tired. And some days, I don't know if I'm doing any of this right." He paused, swallowing hard. "But I show up. Every single day, I show up. Because that's what love is when you strip away everything else. It's just showing up." He straightened, suddenly aware of how foolish this was, standing in a stranger's hospital room, confessing to someone who couldn't hear him. He turned toward the door. "Money can't buy someone to stay when you need them most," Marcus said, glancing back one last time. "But showing up can." He left without another word, his cartwheels squeaking softly down the empty hallway. In the bed, Julian Ashford lay perfectly still, his eyes closed, his breathing steady. The machines beeped their measured rhythm. To anyone watching, he was unconscious. But he wasn't. He'd woken hours ago, shortly after they'd brought him in. The doctors had checked his vitals, confirmed the concussion was mild, and left him to rest. He'd kept his eyes closed out of instinct, the same instinct that had kept him alive in boardrooms and negotiations for 15 years. Observe before you engage. Learn what people say when they think you can't hear. Usually it was nothing. Nurses gossiping. Doctors discussing his prognosis in clinical terms. His assistant, briefly, confirming meetings would be rescheduled. But this, the janitor's voice, low and unpolished and devastatingly honest, this was something else entirely. Julian lay in the darkness, the stranger's words settling into him like stones in still water. Showing up. He built an empire on vision, on strategy, on being 3 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. He'd acquired companies, disrupted industries, amassed wealth that could buy almost anything, and yet he couldn't remember the last time someone had simply shown up. For him. Not for his money, not for access, not for what he could provide. Just shown up. The janitor's voice had held no expectation, no performance. Just exhaustion and truth. The kind of truth Julian had stopped hearing years ago, if he'd ever heard it at all. He opened his eyes slowly, staring at the ceiling tiles. His head ached. His ribs were bruised, but it was a different kind of pain. Tightening in his chest. Now the recognition of something absent. Something he hadn't known he was missing, until a stranger named it in the dark. Julian Ashford, who had everything, realized he had no one who would speak to him the way that man had spoken. No one who would stand in his doorway and offer the truth without asking for anything in return. He didn't know the janitor's name, didn't know anything about him except that he had a daughter named Zoe and a wife named Sarah who had died. But he knew one thing with sudden absolute clarity: he needed to find him. Julian left the hospital 3 days later against his doctor's recommendations. He had work to do, they said. He needed rest, they insisted. He signed the discharge papers anyway. What he actually needed was to find the janitor. It took his assistant less than 2 hours. Marcus Chen, night shift custodial staff, employed for 6 years. Also worked day shifts at a warehouse in South Baltimore. Widowed. 1 dependent. Address on file. Julian sat in his car outside the apartment building for 20 minutes before going in. It was a modest complex, well-maintained but worn, the kind of place where people worked hard to stay afloat. He climbed to the 3rd floor, found apartment 3C, and knocked. The man who opened the door looked tired. He wore jeans and a faded t-shirt, and his eyes held the cautious wariness of someone used to unexpected trouble. Recognition flickered across his face. Mr. Something. Ashford. Not a question. Marcus's voice was flat, controlled. Marcus Chen. That's me. Marcus didn't move from the doorway. If this is about me being in your room, I can explain. It's not. Julian paused. May I come in? Marcus hesitated, then stepped back. The apartment was small but clean, organized with the precision of someone who had no margin for chaos. A child's backpack sat by the door. Drawings covered the refrigerator. The living room held a couch, a coffee table with homework spread across it, and a bookshelf packed with library books. Zoe's at school, Marcus said in answering the unasked question. I have about an hour before I need to pick her up. So whatever this is, let's get to it. Julian had prepared a speech. He'd rehearsed it in the car, but standing in this small apartment that somehow felt more like a home than his estate ever had, the words dissolved. I heard what you said, he said instead. In the hospital. I was awake. Marcus went very still. I see. You talked about showing up. I did. I need someone who knows how to do that. Julian kept his voice level, professional. I'm looking for someone to help manage my household. Personal affairs, estate management. The pay is $200,000 a year, full benefits, flexible hours. Marcus stared at him. You came here to offer me a job. Yes, because I talked to you when I thought you were unconscious. Because you said something true, Julian corrected. And in my experience, people who say true things when nothing's at stake are rare. Marcus crossed his arms. I'm not a charity case. I'm not offering charity. I'm offering a job. One I need filled. You have staff. You have people. I have employees, Julian said. There's a difference. The words hung between them. Marcus looked away, his jaw tight. Julian could see him calculating the money against the pride, the opportunity against the cost of accepting it. Why me? Marcus asked, finally. Really? Julian considered lying, considered offering some pragmatic reason that would make this transaction cleaner, simpler. But something about this man, this apartment, this life built on honesty and exhaustion demanded better. Because I've spent 15 years surrounded by people who want something from me, Julian said quietly. And you're the first person in a long time who spoke to me like I was just a person. I don't know if you can understand what that means when you're someone like me, but it matters. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer. I have conditions. All right. Zoe comes first. Always. Her school, her schedule, her stability, none of that gets disrupted. Agreed. I keep my hospital job, at least for the first 3 months, until I know this is real. That's fair. And no special treatment. I work, I get paid, that's the deal. The second it starts feeling like charity or pity, I'm out. Julian nodded. Understood. Marcus exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. He looked at the homework on the table, at the drawings in the fridge, at the life he'd built through sheer determination. Then he looked back at Julian. When do you want me to start? Monday, Julian said. If that works. It works. They shook hands. Marcus's grip was firm, calloused from years of physical work. Julian felt something shift in that brief contact, not quite trust, but the possibility of it. One more thing, Marcus said as Julian turned to leave. Whatever you think you heard in that hospital room, I'm not some wise sage who has life figured out. I'm just a guy trying to do right by his kid. Don't expect more than that. Julian paused at the door. That's exactly what I'm expecting, he said. Nothing more, nothing less. He left Marcus standing in the doorway of his small apartment, and for the first time in years, Julian felt something like hope. Marcus brought Zoe to the estate on Saturday morning. He'd explained it carefully. A new job, a big house, a man who needed help. Zoe had listened with the serious expression she wore when processing information, then asked if she could bring her homework. It's not a playdate, baby, Marcus had said gently. I know, Dad, but you'll be working, and I have math. So they arrived with Zoe's backpack and Marcus's uncertainty, pulling up the long driveway to a house that looked more like a museum than a home, stone and glass and perfect landscaping. Zoe pressed her face to the window. He lives here alone? She asked. Yeah, that's sad. Marcus parked near the front entrance. Before he could second-guess himself, the door opened and Julian appeared. He wore dark jeans and a sweater casual, but the kind of casual that cost more than Marcus's monthly rent. He looked uncertain in a way Marcus hadn't expected. Marcus, welcome. Julian's eyes dropped to Zoe. And you must be Zoe. Zoe studied him with the frank assessment of childhood. You're the one who was in the car accident. I am. Does your head still hurt? Sometimes, less now. She nodded, accepting this. My dad says you have a lot of books. I do. Would you like to see them? Marcus expected Zoe to be shy, to hide behind his leg the way she sometimes did with strangers. But she simply said, okay, and followed Julian inside. The interior was exactly what Marcus had imagined. High ceilings, expensive furniture, art on the walls that probably cost more than most people's houses. Everything was beautiful. Nothing was lived in. It felt like walking through a showroom, a space designed to impress rather than inhabit. Julian led them through rooms that seemed to multiply a formal living room, a dining room with a table that could seat 20, a kitchen that gleamed with unused appliances. Finally, he opened a door to a library. Floor-to-ceiling shelves, thousands of books, a rolling ladder, leather chairs positioned near tall windows. Zoe's eyes went wide. Wow. You can read here whenever you visit, Julian said. If you'd like. Can I really? Of course. She walked to the nearest shelf, tilting her head to read the spines. Julian glanced at Marcus, something like nervousness in his expression. Marcus realized the man was trying, genuinely trying, and had no idea if he was doing it right. Why do you have so many books if you live alone? Zoe asked, still examining the shelves. Julian blinked. I like to read. But don't you get lonely reading by yourself all the time? The question, innocent and direct, seemed to hit Julian like a physical thing. He recovered quickly, but not quickly enough. Sometimes, he admitted. Zoe turned to face him. You could read with other people. That makes it less lonely. I suppose I could. The piano in the other room, Zoe continued, moving to the window. Does it work? Yes. Do you play it? Not anymore. Why not? Julian looked genuinely stumped. I'm not sure. I just stopped. That's sad too, Zoe said matter-of-factly. Then, spotting something outside, you have a garden. Dad, can I look? Marcus nodded, and Zoe disappeared through the library's side door that led to a terrace. Through the window, they watched her crouch beside a flower bed, examining something intently. I'm not good with children, Julian said quietly. I don't know what to say to them. You're doing fine, Marcus said. She's honest. You're being honest back. That's all kids really want. She asks difficult questions. Yeah, she does that. Marcus smiled slightly. Fair warning, she'll probably ask more. They stood in silence for a moment, watching Zoe in the garden. Then Marcus said, So, where do you want me to start? Over the next hour, Julian showed him the estate, the main house, the guest quarters, the office wing Julian rarely used. He explained the household systems, the staff schedule, a housekeeper twice a week, a groundskeeper on Thursdays, the routines that had calcified over years of living alone. Marcus listened, asked questions, made notes, but what he noticed most was the absence: no photos, no personal touches, no evidence that a life was being lived here, rather than simply maintained. You eat dinner? Marcus asked as they returned to the main house. Julian looked confused by the question. Yes. Usually something prepared by the housekeeper, or I order in. You cook? Not really. You have a kitchen that costs more than my car, and you don't cook. I never learned. Marcus shook his head, not unkindly. We're going to fix that. That evening, after Marcus had officially started his duties organizing Julian's office, setting up systems for mail and scheduling, he made dinner. Nothing fancy. Pasta, garlic bread, salad. Zoe did her homework at the kitchen island while Marcus worked, and Julian hovered uncertainly in the doorway, clearly unsure if he was allowed in his own kitchen. You can sit, Marcus said without looking up. You're not in the way. Julian sat. Zoe showed him her math worksheet fractions, and he found himself explaining the problems, his voice growing more confident as they worked through each one. Marcus stirred sauce and listened to his daughter laugh at something Julian said, and felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen. When dinner was ready, Marcus set 3 plates at the small kitchen table, not the formal dining room. Julian started to protest, then stopped. They ate together, Zoe chattering about school, Marcus interjecting occasionally, Julian mostly quiet but present. After Zoe and Marcus left that evening, Julian stood in his kitchen, really stood in it for the first time in years. The dishes were in the sink. There was a smudge of tomato sauce on the counter. Zoe had left the crayon behind, abandoned next to her completed homework. The room felt different, warmer, like someone had turned on a light he hadn't known was off. Julian picked up the crayon blue and set it carefully on the counter where he'd remembered to return it. The house was still too big, still too empty, but for the first time, it didn't feel quite so cold. The first month passed in careful increments. Marcus learned the rhythms of Julian's life: the early morning emails, the conference calls that stretched into evening, the way Julian worked until exhaustion forced him to stop. He learned that Julian took his coffee black, that he forgot to eat lunch more often than not, that he had to tell when stressed. His hand would move to his temple, fingers pressing against the residual ache from the accident. Julian learned different rhythms. The sound of Marcus arriving each morning, the quiet efficiency with which he moved through tasks, the way Zoe's voice carried through the halls on the afternoons she came after school, bright and unbothered by the house's formality. He learned that Marcus hummed while he worked old songs, sometimes hymns, and that the sound made the house feel less like a mausoleum. They were careful with each other. Professional. Marcus called him Mr. Ashford for the first 3 weeks until Julian finally said, "It's just Julian." Marcus had nodded, but the formality lingered in other ways in the distance he maintained, in the way he never presumed. But slowly, inevitably, things shifted. It started small. Marcus began leaving meals in the refrigerator with reheating instructions. Julian, who had survived on takeout and protein bars for years, found himself actually eating dinner. Real food. He mentioned this once, casually, and Marcus just shrugged. "Can't have you passing out from low blood sugar," Marcus said. "Bad for business." "Is that concern for my well-being or job security?" Julian asked, surprising himself with the teasing tone. "Both," Marcus replied, and there was the hint of a smile. Zoe became a regular presence. She'd finish her homework in the library, then wander, curious and fearless. She asked Julian questions he'd never considered. Why did he have art he never looked at? Why were all the rooms so big if he never used them? Didn't he get lost? Sometimes, Julian admitted once. They were in the library, Zoe reading while Julian worked on his laptop nearby. Metaphorically, I mean. Zoe looked up from her book. What's metaphorically? It means not literally lost, but feeling lost anyway. She considered this with her characteristic seriousness. My dad says when you're lost, you should stay in one place until someone finds you. Does he? Yeah. He says moving around just makes it worse. She returned to her book, the wisdom delivered and forgotten in the same breath. But Julian didn't forget. He thought about it that night, alone in his study, and realized he'd been moving for 15 years, acquiring, expanding, pushing forward, and had never once stopped long enough to be found. By the second month, the house had changed in small, irreversible ways. Marcus's organizing extended beyond Julian's office. Books got rearranged by subject rather than size. The formal living room gained a throw blanket navy soft draped over the couch. Zoe's drawings appeared on the refrigerator, held by magnets Marcus brought from home. The piano was tuned. Julian noticed everything. He noticed because each change made the space feel less like his and more like theirs, and the possessive pronoun shift terrified and comforted him in equal measure. One evening, Marcus was cooking again. He'd started doing this twice a week. Always casual, always insisting he was making extra anyway, when Julian entered the kitchen and simply started helping. He didn't ask. He just washed vegetables while Marcus worked at the stove. You don't have to do that, Marcus said. I know. They worked in companionable silence. Zoe was in the library, reading. The kitchen smelled like garlic and rosemary. Outside, rain began to fall, soft against the windows. I'm teaching you to cook, Marcus said suddenly, starting next week. Julian looked up, surprised. That's not in the job description. Neither is most of what I do here. Marcus met his eyes. You should know how to feed yourself. It's basic. I can order food. That's not the same, and you know it. Julian wanted to argue, to maintain some boundary, but he found he didn't want to. All right, he said quietly. Teach me. Marcus nodded, something satisfied in his expression, and returned to the stove. The cooking lessons became a Thursday ritual. Marcus was patient, methodical, explaining techniques the way he explained everything clearly without judgment. Julian was a terrible student at first, burning rice, oversalting pasta, cutting vegetables into uneven chunks, but he kept trying and Marcus kept teaching. And slowly Julian began to understand that this wasn't really about cooking at all. It was about learning to care for himself, about learning that he was worth the effort. Zoe joined them sometimes, standing on a stool to stir sauce or measure flour. She'd narrate what she was doing in a solemn voice. Now we add the sugar, exactly 1 cup. And Julian found himself charmed by her seriousness. She approached cooking the way she approached everything, with focused attention and absolute honesty. "Julian, you're cutting those too big," she'd say, peering at his work. "Am I?" "Yeah, they should be smaller, like this." She'd demonstrate her small hands surprisingly capable. "See? I see. Thank you, Chef Zoe." She'd beam at the title, and something in Julian's chest would ache with a feeling he couldn't name. One night after dinner, Zoe asked if she could play the piano. Julian tensed. He hadn't touched that instrument in years, hadn't wanted to remember why he'd learned in the first place. But Marcus was watching him with quiet understanding, and Julian found himself saying yes. Zoe played simple songs, the kind taught in beginner lessons. Her mistakes were frequent, her timing uncertain, but she played with complete unself-consciousness. When she finished, she turned on the bench. "Will you play something?" she asked Julian. "I'm very rusty." "That's okay. I won't judge." Marcus, sitting nearby with coffee, hid a smile. Julian looked at the piano, at this child who asked for things with such easy trust, and sat down beside her. His hands found the keys like remembering a language he'd thought forgotten. He played something simple, a nocturne, slow and melancholy. His technique was rough, his tempo inconsistent, but the music filled the room anyway. When he finished, there was silence. "That was sad," Zoe said finally. "Yes. But beautiful too." "Yes," Julian agreed softly. It was. By the third month, something had solidified between them, not quite friendship, not quite family, but something in the unnamed space between. Julian found himself scheduling meetings around Zoe's school pickup time, so Marcus wouldn't have to rush. Marcus stopped asking permission to rearrange things and simply did what needed doing. Zoe treated the estate like a second home, leaving books in the library, shoes by the door, small traces of her presence that Julian never asked to be removed. They had dinner together most evenings now. Sometimes Julian cooked. His skills had improved under Marcus's patient instruction, and sometimes Marcus did. They'd sit at the kitchen table, never the formal dining room, and talk about ordinary things. Zoe's school day. A problem at Julian's company. A book Marcus was reading. The conversations were unremarkable and somehow essential. Julian learned that Marcus sang in his church choir, that he'd wanted to be a teacher before life had taken a different path, that he still visited Sarah's grave every Sunday after service. Marcus learned that Julian had built his company from nothing, that his parents had died when he was 23, that he'd spent 15 years confusing achievement with purpose. Neither man spoke about what was growing between them. It felt too fragile, too important to name. But it was there, in the small things. The way Julian made sure the library was warm before Zoe arrived. The way Marcus brought Julian coffee without being asked, prepared exactly right. The way they'd ended up watching a movie together one Friday night. Zoe had chosen it. Something animated and sweet, and Julian had looked over to find Marcus's eyes on him instead of the screen. Expression unreadable. "What?" Julian had asked softly. "Nothing," Marcus said. But he'd smiled, and Julian had felt something shift in his chest. One Tuesday, Zoe came down with a fever at school. Marcus got the call during a meeting with Julian and immediately stood to leave. Julian watched him gather his things, saw the worry tighten his face, and made a decision. "I'll drive you," Julian said. "You don't have to." "I know. I'm driving you." They picked Zoe up together. She was pale, quiet, leaning against Marcus in the car on the way back to the estate. Neither man questioned that they were bringing her there instead of to the apartment. It was simply understood. Marcus carried her to one of the guest rooms, the smallest one, the coziest, and settled her in bed. Julian brought water, children's medicine. He'd had his assistant purchase extra blankets. They took turns through the afternoon, one staying with Zoe while the other worked nearby. By evening, Zoe's fever had risen. She was restless, uncomfortable, asking for her mother in the half-conscious way of sick children. Marcus sat on the edge of her bed, running cool cloths over her forehead, his voice low and steady. "I know, baby. I know it hurts. I'm right here." Julian stood in the doorway, watching. He'd never seen this, the quiet vigilance of a parent caring for a sick child. The way Marcus's hands were gentle but certain. The way he never seemed frustrated or impatient, just present. Around midnight, Marcus convinced Zoe to take more medicine. She swallowed it, made a face, then curled into her father's side and fell into restless sleep. Marcus didn't move. He stayed there, one hand on her back, feeling each breath. Julian brought coffee, sat in the chair by the window. "You should rest," Marcus said quietly. "This could be a long night." "So could yours." "I'll stay." Marcus looked at him for a long moment, something passing between them that had no words. Then he nodded. They sat in silence, keeping watch. Sometimes Zoe would stir and Marcus would soothe her back to sleep. Sometimes Julian would check her temperature or refill the water glass. Mostly they just waited, the way people do when someone they love is hurting and there's nothing to do but be present. Around 3 in the morning, Zoe's fever broke. Her breathing evened. Her skin cooled. Marcus exhaled, the tension draining from his shoulders. He looked at Julian across the dim room. "Thank you," Marcus said, "for staying." "Where else would I be?" Julian asked, and meant it completely. Something changed in Marcus's expression, a wall coming down, a door opening. "Yeah," he said softly. "Where else?" In the weeks that followed, they stopped pretending this was just a job. Marcus brought his books, the ones he read for pleasure, and they ended up on Julian's shelves alongside the pristine hardcovers. Julian bought groceries, actual groceries, and learned to think about what the three of them might want for dinner. Zoe started keeping pajamas in the guest room, just in case. They developed routines that had nothing to do with employment. Saturday mornings, Marcus would make pancakes and Zoe would help, flour ending up everywhere. Sunday afternoons, if Julian didn't have urgent work, they'd do something together, walk around the estate, play board games, sit in the library. Once, they drove to the park, and Zoe taught Julian how to pump on the swings, his expensive shoes in the mulch, his laughter surprising all three of them. Julian found himself memorizing details, the way Marcus's hands looked when he chopped vegetables, capable and sure. The sound of Zoe reading aloud, stumbling over difficult words, then sounding them out with determination. The way the house felt when they were in it alive, warm, like something worth coming home to. He was falling. He knew it. Had known it for weeks, maybe months, but the knowledge didn't frighten him the way he'd expected. It felt inevitable, like watching dawn arrive. You couldn't stop it. You could only decide whether to close your eyes or watch it happen. One evening, after Zoe had fallen asleep on the couch during a movie, Marcus carried her to the guest room. Julian followed with her backpack, setting it by the door. They stood in the hallway after, neither quite ready to return to their separate spaces. "She's happy here," Marcus said quietly. "I can see it." "Are you?" Julian asked. "Happy here." Marcus met his eyes. In the dim hallway light, his expression was open in a way Julian had rarely seen. "Yeah," Marcus said. "I am." The words hung between them, weighted with everything they weren't saying. Julian wanted to reach out, to close the distance, to name what this was becoming, but he was terrified of breaking something precious through presumption. "Good," Julian managed. "That's good." Marcus smiled small, knowing. "Get some sleep, Julian. We're planting that garden with Zoe tomorrow, remember?" "Right. The garden." "The garden," Marcus confirmed, and there was warmth in his voice that made Julian's chest ache. They said goodnight. Marcus went to the guest room to sleep near Zoe. Julian went to his own room, alone, and lay awake thinking about a man who showed up, a child who asked difficult questions, and a life he hadn't known he was allowed to want. Outside, spring was arriving. Inside, something else was growing slower, deeper, taking root in the quiet spaces between words. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Julian fell asleep feeling something like peace. The call came on a Wednesday morning in early April. Julian was in the kitchen with Zoe, helping her with a science project about plant growth. Marcus was reorganizing the office upstairs. The sun was bright through the windows, and Zoe was explaining photosynthesis with the earnest authority of a 7-year-old who'd just learned something fascinating. Then Julian's phone rang. He glanced at the screen and something in his expression shifted. "I need to take this," he said, already standing. "Zoe, keep working. I'll be right back." But he wasn't right back. Marcus found him 2 hours later, still on the phone in his study. His voice clipped and cold in a way Marcus hadn't heard in months. Through the half-open door, he caught fragments: hostile takeover, board meeting, damage control. Julian's hand was pressed to his temple. The tell Marcus had learned meant stress, pressure, pain. Marcus retreated quietly. This was business, not his place. But as the day wore on, Julian didn't emerge. Marcus made lunch. It went uneaten. He tried to bring coffee and was waved away. By the time he needed to take Zoe home, Julian was on his third conference call, his face drawn, his shoulders rigid with tension. "Is Julian okay?" Zoe asked in the car. "He's dealing with work stuff, baby. He'll be fine." He looked sad. "Yeah," Marcus said quietly. He did. The pattern continued. Julian worked 18-hour days, took calls at midnight, barely slept. He stopped coming to the kitchen for meals, stopped joining them in the evenings. When Marcus saw him, it was only in passing. Julian moving through the house like a ghost, present but absent, there but unreachable. Marcus gave him space. He understood pressure, understood that sometimes a man needed to focus. But after a week, the space started to feel like distance. After 2 weeks, it felt like abandonment. Marcus kept the house running, kept meals prepared, kept Zoe occupied and unworried. But he felt the absence like a physical thing, an ache that had no name. On Friday evening of the second week, Marcus found Julian in his study at 10 p.m., surrounded by papers, his eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. "You need to eat," Marcus said from the doorway. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You haven't had a real meal in days." "Marcus, I don't have time for this. Make time." Julian looked up, and there was something cold in his expression. The same professional distance Marcus had seen that first day at the hospital. "I appreciate your concern, but I'm handling it." "Are you?" "Yes." Julian's voice was sharp. "This is my company, my responsibility. I don't expect you to understand the stakes." The words landed like a slap. Marcus went very still. "Right," he said quietly. "Of course." He turned to leave. "Marcus." Julian started, but Marcus was already gone. That night, Marcus lay awake in the guest room where he'd been staying more often than his own apartment, staring at the ceiling. He'd been a fool. He'd let himself believe this was real, that he belonged here, that what they built meant something. But Julian's words had been clear. "I don't expect you to understand," because Marcus was the help, the employee, the man who'd been useful for a while but would never truly be an equal. The next morning, Marcus was professional, distant. He did his job and nothing more. No extra meals, no lingering conversations. When Zoe asked why they weren't eating with Julian, Marcus said simply that Julian was busy. "But he's always busy now," Zoe said, her voice small. "I know, baby. Did we do something wrong?" The question broke something in Marcus. "No," he said firmly, pulling her close. "No, sweetheart, you didn't do anything wrong." Sunday afternoon, Marcus was packing Zoe's things from the guest room. It was time to stop pretending, time to go back to their apartment and their real life, when Zoe appeared in the doorway to Julian's study. Marcus was down the hall, but could hear her voice, clear and unafraid. "Are you leaving?" she asked. Julian looked up, startled. "What? Are you leaving? Because you're acting like people act before they leave. You're here, but you're not really here." "Zoe, it's complicated. My mom did that before she died," Zoe continued, her voice steady despite the tears starting in her eyes. "She started pulling away, getting distant. And then she was gone. So I'm asking, are you leaving because you're scared or because you want to?" Julian stared at this child who saw too much, understood too much. "I'm not," he started, then stopped. The answer caught in his throat. "Because if you're scared, that's okay," Zoe said. "My dad's scared all the time, but he stays anyway. That's what people who love you do. They stay." She left before Julian could respond, her footsteps quick down the hallway. Marcus met her, picked her up even though she was getting too big for it, and carried her to the guest room. He didn't let her see his face. Hours later, after Zoe had cried herself to sleep and Marcus sat in the dark keeping watch, he heard footsteps in the hallway. The door opened slightly. Julian stood there, silhouetted against the light. his face haggard. "Marcus," he said, his voice rough. "Can we talk?" "Zoe's sleeping. I know. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Marcus looked at him for a long moment. Then, quietly, "You don't have to be perfect to be loved, Julian. You just have to stay." Julian's breath caught. In the darkness, Marcus couldn't see his face, but he heard it, the sound of something breaking open, of walls finally coming down. "I don't know how," Julian whispered. "Yes, you do," Marcus said gently. "You've been doing it for months. You just forgot." Julian was silent for a long moment. Then, "I'm terrified." "Of what?" "Of losing this. Of proving I'm not capable of keeping something real." Marcus stood, moved to the doorway. They were close now, close enough that Marcus could see the exhaustion and fear and desperate hope in Julian's eyes. "You already have something real," Marcus said. "You've had it. You just have to choose it." Julian's hand came up, hesitant, and Marcus took it. Held it. Let Julian feel that he was there, solid and certain. "Stay," Marcus said quietly. "Not in your office. Not in your head. Here. With us." Julian's fingers tightened around his. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay," he whispered. The change didn't happen overnight, but it happened. Julian stepped back from the crisis at work, delegated, restructured, made the hard decision to let his board handle what he'd always insisted on controlling himself. The company survived. The takeover was averted. And Julian realized that his empire didn't need him every hour of every day. It never had. What needed him was here, in this house that had become a home, with these people who had become his family. He started showing up again. Really showing up. Not just physically present, but they're engaged, attentive, clear. He cooked breakfast with Marcus, helped Zoe with homework, sat in the library in the evenings, reading while they read, content in the quiet companionship. Marcus watched this return with cautious hope. He didn't push, didn't demand explanations or promises. He simply let Julian find his way back, step by careful step. One evening, 3 weeks after the fracture, they sat on the back terrace after Zoe had gone to bed. Spring had fully arrived. The garden they planted together was blooming. The air soft and warm. Marcus had brought out coffee. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky fade from gold to violet. "I need to tell you something," Julian said finally. Marcus waited. "This what we have here. It's not what I hired you for." "I know. And it's not temporary anymore. Not for me." Julian turned to face him. "I don't know exactly what to call it, but I know it matters. You matter. Zoe matters. This matters more than anything else in my life." Marcus set down his coffee carefully. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I don't want you to be my employee anymore. I don't want you to leave at night wondering if this is real or if it's just a job." Julian's voice was steady but vulnerable. "I want you to stay. Both of you. Not as staff, as family." The word hung between them, family with all its weight and promise. "Julian, I know it's complicated. I know I've given you reasons to doubt me, but I'm asking anyway." Julian met his eyes. "Stay. Choose this. Choose us." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and Julian felt fear spike in his chest. He'd miscalculated, presumed too much, ruined everything. Then Marcus said, "I need you to understand something." "All right. I'm not a project, neither is Zoe. We're not here to fix you or complete you or teach you how to be human." Marcus's voice was gentle but firm. "We're just people. Complicated, messy people with our own grief and fear and baggage. If you're choosing us, you're choosing all of that. The hard parts too." "I know. Do you? Because when things get difficult, and they will, you can't retreat into your office and shut us out. You can't decide we're too much trouble and walk away. I won't. You did before." The truth of it stung, but Julian didn't flinch. "You're right. I did. And I'm sorry. I'm still learning how to do this, how to let people in, how to stay when I'm scared." But I'm asking for the chance to keep learning. With you. Marcus studied him in the fading light. Julian could see him weighing it, measuring the risk against the possibility. Finally, Marcus asked, "What does this look like? Practically?" "However you want it to look," Julian said. "You and Zoe move in fully. This becomes your home, not just a place you visit. We figure out the rest as we go: schools, routines, boundaries. Whatever you need to feel safe and certain. And if it doesn't work? If we try and it falls apart? Then we'll deal with it like adults. But I don't think it will fall apart." Julian's voice softened. "I think it's already been working. We just haven't named it yet." Marcus exhaled slowly. Zoe would be thrilled. "And you?" "I'm terrified," Marcus admitted. "I spent 3 years keeping everything controlled, keeping us safe. This feels like free-falling." "I know. I'm terrified too." Julian reached out, hesitant, and Marcus took his hand. Their fingers intertwined, warm and certain. "But I'd rather be terrified with you than safe and alone." Marcus laughed softly, shaking his head. "That's the most honest thing you've ever said to me." "I'm trying to be more honest. I've noticed." They sat in silence, hands clasped, the weight of the decision settling around them. Marcus thought about Zoe, about how happy she'd been here. He thought about the life he'd built through sheer determination and whether he was allowed to want more than survival. He thought about this man beside him, flawed and learning and trying, and realized he'd already made his choice weeks ago. Maybe months ago. "Okay," Marcus said quietly. "Okay? Yes. We'll stay. We'll try this." Julian's breath left him in a rush. "Really? Really? But Julian." Marcus squeezed his hand. "You have to talk to me. When you're struggling, when you're scared, when things are hard. You have to let me in. That's the deal." "I can do that," and we go slow with Zoe. "We don't make promises we're not sure we can keep." "Agreed." Marcus nodded, something settling in his chest, not certainty exactly, but something close. Hope, maybe. Trust. The possibility of building something lasting. "She's going to want to redecorate her room," Marcus said, smiling slightly. "She can paint it purple if she wants." "She will definitely want to paint it purple." Julian laughed, and the sound was lighter than Marcus had heard in weeks. They sat together as night fell, hands still clasped, and watched the stars emerge one by one. The house behind them glowed with warm light. Inside, Zoe slept peacefully in her room, the purple one, already in her dreams. Tomorrow they'd start figuring out the logistics, but tonight they simply sat together in the quiet, two men who'd found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and chosen, against all odds, to stay. 6 months later, the house had transformed. Zoe's room was indeed purple lavender walls with white trim, chosen after 3 trips to the paint store in serious deliberation. Her artwork covered the hallway leading to it, a gallery of crayon and watercolor that Julian had insisted on framing properly. Marcus's books filled the shelves in the library, interspersed with Julian's, their reading habits blending until neither could remember whose was whose. The kitchen was lived in now, coffee rings on the counter, Zoe's spelling tests held by magnets to the refrigerator, a crack in one of the fancy plates from the time Marcus had taught Julian to juggle citrus fruits. The formal dining room had been converted to a music room. Zoe was learning piano properly now, and the sound of her practicing filled the house most evenings. The garden they'd planted had flourished. Tomatoes, herbs, flowers Zoe had chosen for their colors. Julian had discovered he liked working with soil, liked the simple logic of planting and tending and watching things grow. Marcus still worked part-time at the hospital 2 nights a week because it mattered to him, and Julian understood that some things weren't about necessity. Julian had restructured his company to allow for actual work-life balance, a phrase his board had initially treated like a foreign language. He worked from home twice a week. He made it to Zoe's school events. He was learning that presence was a practice, not a destination. On this particular Sunday morning, Marcus was making pancakes while Zoe sat at the counter telling him about a book she'd finished. Julian came downstairs in jeans and a t-shirt, barefoot, his hair still damp from the shower. He paused in the doorway, not entering, just watching. Marcus at the stove, spatula in hand, listening to their daughter with the patient attention he brought to everything. Zoe gesturing animatedly, syrup already on her fingers though she hadn't started eating yet. The morning light streaming through the windows, warm and golden, the sound of home conversation and laughter and the sizzle of butter in a pan. Julian had spent 15 years building an empire, but this ordinary Sunday morning in a kitchen that smelled like vanilla and coffee, this was the first thing he'd ever built that felt like it mattered. Marcus glanced over, caught him watching, and smiled. You planning to stand there all morning or help? Helping, Julian said, moving into the room. He kissed the top of Zoe's head in passing casual now. Natural and took his place beside Marcus at the stove. Flip those, Marcus instructed, nodding at the griddle. Julian flipped the pancakes. Only one broke apart. Progress. Better, Marcus said, bumping his shoulder gently. You're learning. I have a good teacher. Zoe groaned. You guys are so gross. Eat your breakfast, Marcus told her, but he was smiling. They sat down together as the sun climbed higher. Three people who'd found each other in the spaces between loss and hope. The conversation flowed easy, comfortable plans for the day. A movie Zoe wanted to see, whether they should plant pumpkins in the fall garden. Outside, the world continued. Inside, in this house that had finally become a home, roots went deep. Not perfect, not without effort, but real, and that, Julian thought, watching Marcus laugh at something Zoe said, was worth everything.